Welcome everyone to Straight Science. Straight Science is an evening science presentation series put on by UAF Northwest Campus in Nome and UAF Alaska Sea Grant also in Nome. And both Alaska Sea Grant and UAF Northwest Campus are public servants of the Bering Strait region. So we serve all peoples in the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Yupik peoples. Now, tonight, this is an interesting one because I'm hoping we get callers as well. And so everyone knows callers get a preference here. And I'm going to, except for the speaker and myself, I'm going to ask everybody to turn their video off because we sometimes say, yeah, thank you. Because during this part, we have broadband issues. And tonight, I'm not even in Nome. Straight Science is on the road in Utqiagvik for a conference, the Alaska Eskimo Whaling Commission and Kivik. So we're in the North Slope Boroughs Department of Wildlife Management's conference room. And this is a most interesting, I'm really excited about this Straight Science because this one literally fell from the sky. So on St. Lawrence Island, it has been a lot of work on the part of hunters and other conservationists to get the emperor goose numbers back up to where they can be hunted. And a gentleman from Gamble on St. Lawrence Island was harvested an emperor goose and opened it up. And sure enough, he saw something inside he'd never seen. And that was Tyler Lewis's piece of equipment. So one thing led to another, and this emperor goose wanted everyone in the region to know a little bit more about what's happening, and not a project that starts in our region, but certainly a project that is relevant to our region. If a bird can drop out and we've got Tyler Lewis here, that is certainly an interesting event. So Tyler Lewis is a biologist with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game. He's calling tonight in from Anchorage. And he works for the Division of Wildlife Conservation's Migratory Bird Program. And so I guess if that's enough of an intro, Tyler, I think you need to just put up your first slide so everybody knows they're in the right place, and take it away. If you have any questions, let me know. I will be monitoring the chat box. And like I say, if there's any callers get preference regarding questions and that sort of thing. Everyone knows to just jump in.
Okay.
All right. With that, thank you so much. It'll be fun.
Okay, you see my screen?
It looks beautiful. What's not to love about the emperor goose?
Okay, thank you, everybody. Glad to be here. As Gay mentioned, I'm Tyler Lewis from Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and I'm going to talk tonight about some research that we've been doing over the it's been about 5 years now with emperor geese. And in order to do that and to kind of set the stage for how this came to be, I just want to fill us in a little bit on the recent history of the emperor goose. And as I wrote here, they have a bit of a checkered past. And by checkered past, I mean in terms of management and population numbers, they've been a bird of some controversy and a bird in the limelight a little bit. Of all our waterfowl species, they've probably recently been the most hotly debated in terms of harvest. And that's because of this population trajectory that you're seeing here. So emperor geese, just to kind of set the stage for how we counted them historically, most of the world's population stages along the Alaska Peninsula in the fall and in the spring, and they congregate on the northern side of the peninsula in those big lagoons along the Bering Sea, Nelson Lagoon, Eisenbeck, a lot of those lagoons. And so that provides a good opportunity to count them. That's been known for a long time. Fortunately, there was a count done in the 1960s. And at that time, they counted about 140,000 emperor geese. And that count, that's our oldest count, and it's kind of always served as the benchmark for maybe what a historic emperor goose population was and what a potential emperor goose population could be. Now that was kind of a one-off survey. Those surveys weren't continued, but they were picked up again in the 1980s, again along the Alaska Peninsula in the spring. And that's the data that you're looking at here. This black trend line is year-to-year counts conducted along the Alaska Peninsula, and the gray line is just a 3-year average, just to smooth out the data a little bit. But focus here in this red box, and as you can see, in 1982, biologists counted over 100,000 geese. And then over the next 5 years, something alarming happened, and the number of geese counted dropped to less than 45,000 in just a 5-year period. So, at least according to the survey, a halving of the population. So that prompted changes in the emperor goose harvest, and following those declines, managers, all parties at the table, agreed that harvest should be closed. And so that started first with the sport harvest in 1986 was closed. And then the following spring and summer, the subsistence harvest in 1987 was closed. So I'm sure unbeknownst to anybody at the table during those talks 30 years ago, it would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall at the time. I'm sure nobody knew that that would be a 30-year closure that they were instigating. But that's what happened. And luckily, over those 30 years, though, we saw progress in the emperor goose population. As you can see, the numbers rebounded, albeit very slowly, but over those 30 years, we had growth. Annualized over that 30-year period, it was a 1.8% realized growth rate. And with that growth, we were able to reinstate harvests in 2017. So it's been 6 years now, I guess going on the 7th year that harvest has been reinstated. So just to provide a little backdrop on what harvest looks like since that came to be, out of all of our waterfowl species, aside from stellars and spectacled eiders, which are listed as threatened under the Endangered Species Act, so they are completely close to harvest. Other than those two, this is the most tightly regulated waterfowl harvest in the state of Alaska. So the fall winter hunt, that's more colloquially known as the sport hunt, what we would traditionally think of as sport hunting. It is administered as a registration permit hunt. So in order to hunt, you need to get a permit. Any hunter in Alaska resident is allowed a permit, but you are only allowed 1 emperor goose per season. And in addition, 25 non-residents can participate in the hunt through a draw lottery. And this sport hunt is capped at a quota of 1,000 birds annually, meaning if that quota of 1,000 birds was met, the sport harvest would be shut down immediately by an emergency order. In addition to the sport hunt, after that 30 years of closure, the subsistence harvest was also opened. That, for the most part, takes part in the spring and the summer months, the early summer months in Western Alaska, places like Kodiak and on the Yukon Delta. And that's the traditional and customary harvest of emperor geese. So in order for the emperor goose harvest to open after those 30 years of closures, all parties at the table had to get together and agree upon a structure for this harvest. And when I say parties at the table, that's the federal government via U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, via their mandate to protect migratory birds, the state of Alaska, represented by the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and the Alaska Migratory Bird Co-Management Council, which is essentially the group representing subsistence users in Western Alaska. So just to provide a little more background, and I don't want to go too far into the weeds, but at that time, it was agreed upon that for the purposes of monitoring emperor geese, we were going to scrap that spring count of emperor geese along the Alaska Peninsula, only because that survey was not very systematically structured. It was more of a fly the lagoons, count as many geese as you can, and repeat the next year. So they decided that there was potentially too many variables affecting that survey, and the survey also didn't lend itself to very good statistics for estimating variation. So they moved to using a survey that's conducted each year on the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta during the breeding season. And this is where probably 80% of the world's population of emperor geese breed. So you're still getting a good segment of the population. And it's a much more systematically structured survey. It's a strip transect survey, and you can estimate confidence intervals from it, and it's much more repeatable from year to year. And importantly, you see much the same pattern with the data. You can see the numbers were depressed in the 1980s, and over these 30 years, you see that growth in the emperor goose population. And then here, I've highlighted in this box the most recent years where the harvest has been open. But in order for the harvest to open, the agreed upon management strategy was we were going to this Yukon Delta survey, and as long as counts remained in this green zone up here each year, and that's above 28,000 on this population index, the harvest remains open. If the counts dip into this yellow zone between 24,000 to 28,000 birds, then conservation measures are considered. So you can see recently, 2019, there's no survey in 2020 because of COVID, and in 2021, we were in that yellow zone. The state halved the quota from 1,000 to 500 birds for the fall winter hunt, the sport harvest, and subsistence users voluntarily stopped collecting eggs from nests on the Yukon Delta. So that's what we did when we hit those two zones. Now, if we dip into this orange zone below 24,000, then both harvests, subsistence and sport harvests, will be closed. So what you can see over these last 6 years is that we've come perilously close to getting back to a closure, which would be very frustrating after having 30 years of opening, especially for subsistence users in the western part of the state. And the questions that we often get was, well, why did those numbers go down? Why do we see these changes from year to year? Is it because of harvest? Is it because of poor winter survival? Why are the numbers going up? Why are they going down? When do geese die? And for the most part, we just throw our hands up. It's difficult to know. And those questions there are really what kind of instigated us down the road of doing this research over the last 5 years, was to try to answer some of these questions better so that when these issues arise, we can provide some more clarity into the situation. So as we started to go down this road and I started to learn about emperor geese and how to monitor emperor geese, I quickly learned that they're a difficult bird to monitor, especially compared to our other geese in Alaska. And these are the three primary reasons. One is their inaccessibility most of the year, and I'll go into each of these in a little more detail. The second is that traditionally, I'm sure many of you are familiar with, for waterfowl, banding is used to collect important demographic data, survival and harvest. It's quite ineffective for emperor geese. And then the third reason I listed here is neck collars, which is kind of akin to banding. It's essentially a band that goes around the neck that allows biologists to track birds from year to year. Again, it's been ineffective for emperor geese because it's lowered their survival. So they're a difficult bird to monitor. And when I say in an inaccessible range, here's their range map on an image provided by Fish and Wildlife Service. So in these orange colors, you can see in the summer, a lot of birds are over in Russia, which are essentially off limits to us. Birds along the Yukon Delta, here on the Seward Peninsula, St. Lawrence Island. And then in the winter, in the fall and the spring, they're fanned out across the entire Aleutian Arc from Kodiak all the way out to Attu. They actually even go out here to the Commander Islands. So at no point during that entire annual cycle are they really coming into contact with any population centers or road systems or any kind of infrastructure that makes them an easy bird to monitor or an economic bird to monitor. And just to provide a little contrast, here's our other 4 primary species of geese in Alaska. And if you look at their wintering range shown in blue, it's a little hard to see for Brant because it's down here along these coastlines. But during the winter, most of our geese that breed up in Alaska are found in highly populous states in the contiguous US, Canada, and Mexico. Because of that, there's a heavy sport harvest and lots of opportunities to monitor these birds These birds coming into close contact with observers and biologists. And all of this links into the second reason that makes emperor geese hard to monitor is the ineffectiveness of banding. So those other geese are being harvested in areas that is home to a more traditional sport harvest. And there, those bands are recovered by hunters and reported. And as I mentioned, you get a lot of data from that. Emperor geese, as you saw, they're not going into these traditional sport harvest areas. And because of that, you can put bands on emperor geese, but you really don't get any band returns. And without band returns, you don't really get any usable data to estimate some of these important demographic rates. So we've, as I mentioned, harvest has been open for 6 years. So far, reported harvest during the fall winter sport harvest, it's averaged 155 emperor geese per year. So the sport harvest is really light. So you're not going to really get many band returns from that. And just to drive that point home, we have banded a lot of emperor geese over the last 30, 40 years, about 11,000. And to date, only 177 bands have been reported from that sample of almost 11,000 birds. So it's not a viable option for data. So collars would be potentially an alternative option. Traditionally, collars look like those you see up in the upper left corner on the Canada goose. They've got a unique code which allows you to read the collars from a distance, track some of the birds over time, and again, keep track of some of these demographic rates. Or more recently, what you're seeing a lot of on geese is shown here on this white-fronted geese, this GPS collar. So it's got a GPS unit built inside it. That's a solar panel there that keeps it charged. And with these, biologists are now getting waypoints on geese every 15 minutes to 30 minutes for up to years at a time. So amazing data streams. So this would be great for emperor geese, except for this fact here that we've tried it before, and it was found that survival of emperor geese at best was decreased by about 20% by collars, if not more. So if it's survival we want to learn about, then it's not a good avenue to throw collars on them when you know you're biasing survival low, 20%, maybe more. Not sure why collars were proved so ineffective for emperor geese, but probably the most prevailing theory is that it may lead to heavy icing. Here's a collar from Canada goose. I scrounged this out of a journal from the 1960s, but you can see all this icing and the ice build up around the collar. It's possible when you think about where emperor geese spend their winter that they would be in climates where the collar would be prone to heavy icing. Perhaps that's why, we're not quite sure. But nonetheless, collars weren't an option. And so we kind of settled in on using satellite transmitters as our preferred technology for keeping track of emperor geese. And these satellite transmitters in particular are internal implants. So they go inside the bird, inside the body cavity. As Gabe mentioned, a hunter in St. Lawrence Island recovered one of our birds and found quite a surprise upon opening the bird up, because that transmitter is inside the body cavity. So that keeps the transmitter free from building up ice. It's warm, it's inside the body cavity. These particular transmitters, they're shown in the picture here, they have a battery life of 3 to 4 years. To conserve battery, they are not on all the time. They go on for 6, and then we shut them down for 72. When they turn on, they're talking to the satellites, transmitting latitudes and longitudes, and they are also transmitting body temperature, so we can keep track of mortalities in almost real time. So that's been quite a advantageous programming feat of these transmitters. So far, we just got back from a trip in Shemya putting out more transmitters. We're up to about 160 transmitters deployed on emperor geese over the last 5 years. 123 of these in adult females and 37 in juveniles. Just to show you here in this bottom right corner what a juvenile looks like during the winter. That's how we're distinguishing our juveniles from adults when we capture in the winter. A adult would have an all white head. You wouldn't see any of that black flecking. The other picture here is an adult female that we've released. And if you look closely, you can see just above the base of her tail, exiting there is the antenna from the transmitter. So this is an adult female in the summer, and they actually have that, often have that yellow dyed head in the summer. That's from rooting around in the mud on the Yukon Delta. So these satellite transmitters are allowing us to address a lot of questions. I'm going to focus in on 4 of them for the rest of the talk tonight. The first one, and that's probably the most important, and it ties back into those population graphs I was showing earlier, trying to understand why these populations go up and down. And that's that these transmitters are giving us seasonal and annual survival estimates. So we can start to answer some of those questions of where are they dying and when are they dying. Secondly, is we're learning a lot about population linkages with Russia. Russia's just always been a black box in terms of emperor geese, where they're going there, what their survival is when they're there, if they're using the same spots from year to year. These allow us to learn about emperor geese use of Russia without having to go to Russia. Third topic I want to briefly address is the winter distribution of emperor geese. Almost all of the research that has been done on emperor research in the previous decades, and there's been some good research, but it's almost all taken place on the Yukon Delta during the summer when the climate's more favorable and when the birds are more accessible. Where they go in the winter when they fan out and their fidelity to those sites year to year is still relatively unknown. So we're learning a lot about winter distribution of emperor geese. And then the fourth topic I wanted to highlight tonight, since we were speaking of the Bering Straits region, was a unique population of emperor geese that breed on the Seward Peninsula that we've also been looking at for a couple of years now. And it's really one of only 2 primary breeding populations in Alaska. And so we're interested in the potential delineation of those 2 populations, how unique they are from each other. So we've deployed transmitters at 2 breeding sites in Alaska in the summer. Down here on the Yukon Delta, where about 80% of the population breeds, we've deployed 74 transmitters thus far. Approximately 75,000 birds are breeding there in the summer, emperor geese. That's an approximation. And then we've deployed 32 tags on the northern side of the Seward Peninsula, and that has a summer population of about 1,200 birds. So when we capture geese in the summer, we're only capturing adult females, and to do that, we're using bow nets and capturing the geese on their nest. So we look for geese on the nest. We find geese that are incubating their eggs. When we find a nest, we go up to the nest and we set this trap here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with it, but it's essentially a hoop that's hinged in the middle at this point and at this point down here, and it's spring loaded so that the top, the top rod bends back on itself. And this is a trigger that we use, a remote trigger that's holding that top rod in place because it's spring loaded and it wants to flip back over. We set that trap up, we leave the nest, and then we wait for the bird to return. We visit the nest later. If we see that she's incubating the eggs, then we can trigger the bow net from a distance. And then this is what it would look like for a captured bird. That upper rod is flipped over the bird, and now the bird is under the net, and her nest was just right here in this tussock of grass. So because they're internally implanted transmitters, we have to bring them back to a veterinarian who does the surgeries to implant the transmitter. The body cavity has to be opened, so we used a trained veterinarian. So that means we have to shuttle birds around in the tundra. To do this, we hike around with kennels on external frame backpacks. When we capture a bird, we put her in the kennel. We hike her back to our camp where our vet is. And here's our vet. This is Dr. Scott Ford. He's done all of our transmitter surgeries to date. So to put the transmitter in, he anesthetizes the bird. So the bird is knocked out for the process. This bird looks like it just finished having its surgery done. You can see here the antenna exiting above the base of the tail. And then after surgery's done, we put the goose in a holding tent for an hour, maybe 2, until the bird is recovered from the anesthetic and is alert again and regained its faculties, and then we release them back into the wild. So in addition to our summer transmitter deployments, we've also been deploying transmitters in the winter. We've used 2 different sites in the winter so far. Kodiak, just along the road system there. We've deployed 22 tags. We'll actually be heading there next week. And Kodiak on the road system has a population of about 2,500 birds. And then the last 2 winters, we have been out to Shemya Island in the Western Aleutians. It's just next to Attu. It's the site of a Air Force base. And Shemya has a wintering population of about 500 birds. So in the winter, of course, we can't catch them on the nests. So we've been using rocket nets, which is a net that's propelled up and over the birds with explosive rockets. And to do this, we target spots where emperor geese come to shore to forage or to roost. And let's see, I've got a video of it. Hopefully it works for you. This is from a capture in Kodiak a couple of years ago. It's going to be in slow motion. So hopefully that video worked. That's, I think, still our biggest capture to date. So it's not as easy as that one made it look. Usually we're capturing more on the order of 5 to 6 birds at a time in small groups. So that's how we capture our birds in the winter. So again, these are internal implants. Here's our vet, Scott Ford again. He's got this bird hooked up and under anesthetic. This is inside a lab in Shemya. So a bird during the winter. You can see that nice clean plumage. So this is an adult. Internal implants have been used as transmitters in waterfowl for probably 25 or 30 years now. And over time, biologists have settled on a rule of thumb where any mortality that occurs in the 2 weeks following surgery is typically attributed to the surgery itself, not to a natural mortality. So as I mentioned, we've deployed 160 transmitters thus far, and we have experienced 2 deaths in the 2-week period following surgery so far. So a 1.25% surgery-related mortality rate. This is really, really low, so we're quite pleased with that. And actually, of the 2 deaths, one of them was a hunter harvested bird, so it's arguable that only one of our deaths has been potentially attributable to our surgeries. So that's a big hurdle, and we're really pleased with that and really pleased with our veterinarian and how he's performed. Looking at some of our annual survival rates for our first 3 years, this is another big piece of the puzzle for us, and this has been real promising. I've got 3 survival estimates just real quick here, but 87%, 81%, and 88%. So those are pretty high survival rates. This is a long-lived bird. Importantly for our study, as you know, we're going to keep getting transmitter data for another 5 to 10 years. It's important that we understand if there's biases associated with our survival data from our transmitters. So these initial survival estimates are quite promising. As a comparison here, I've shown some survival estimates collected from leg bands on the Yukon Delta. So these aren't the small metal bands that I was talking about earlier. These are 3-character plastic bands that are put on birds. And then biologists return to the breeding area from year to year and read those band combinations. And from that, they can estimate and model survival numbers. So typically what they are estimating is annual survival estimates for adult females on the order of 75 to 85%. And they have a pretty good database for that. So our numbers stack up quite favorably with those estimates. So we feel quite confident thus far that we aren't getting biased survival estimates and that our birds are handling the transmitters well, and mortalities that we we are getting through our transmitters are natural mortalities. So to get a little more into the meat of the data in terms of our mortalities, those banding studies, while great, you miss a lot along the way because you're just estimating annual survival at this one point with a whole year in between. You don't know when the birds die and you don't know where the birds die. And so this is where we're really starting to gain some insight with our transmitter data. Here's mortalities for adult females. We've documented 19 mortalities so far. The red dots are breeding mortalities. 2 of those so far. Fall migration, yellow, we've documented 5 mortalities up here in St. Lawrence, Seward Peninsula. During the molt migration, I'll discuss what that is more in later slides, but that takes place during June and then again in August. We've had 3 birds die during that period. During the spring migration, we've documented 3 mortalities, and then in winter, we've documented 6 mortalities. So I haven't generated seasonal survival estimates yet, but it does seem that winter and fall seems to be the prominent time for mortality thus far, which is an interesting observation so far. You might think that winter might be a tough time for them, just given the nature of where they're spending their winter. So there does seem to be a decent component of their overall annual mortality. This one I just wanted to show out of pure interest, just to show you some of the things that we get from some of these mortalities and how they can be quite interesting. Gay mentioned earlier, we had 1 killed on St. Lawrence. That, of course, was an interesting one to learn about. Here's one that happened just this last summer, a bird that we tagged on the Yukon Delta, and it was present down there from June 2nd to 14th. And then we got a couple hits here on June 17th when it was in its migration over to Russia for the molt migration. And then promptly on June 19th, we got a mortality signal. And then we watched this bird proceed about 200 kilometers north over the next 10 days, about 50 kilometers offshore, up to a village in the northern Gulf of Anadyr. So presumably harvested and then transported on a boat, or potentially the transmitter was found. But interesting nonetheless. It was neat to see that play out. Here's a similar graph for our juveniles. We have less of those, 37 birds tagged so far, but we have documented 6 mortalities, 1 during the molt up here in northern Russia, 1 here on the Alaska Peninsula in the spring, and then 4 mortalities in the winter. So again, it seems like winter potentially might be the period of most mortality. We'll learn more about that in the years to come. The second topic I wanted to get into tonight was the use of Russia. As I mentioned, this has always been a bit of a black box in terms of how long geese are staying in Russia, exactly where they're going in Russia, their survival in Russia. So these transmitters have given us a nice peek into that part of their annual cycle. So there is a segment of the emperor goose population that breeds in Russia. But for the most part, all the data I'm going to be presenting here is going to be from Alaska birds that breed in Alaska, but they use Russia during the summer for their flightless wing molts. And there's 2 primary groups that are using it for the flightless wing molt. That's subadults, so birds that are aged 1 to 3. Those birds have not entered the breeding population, and most of them go to Russia to undergo the molt. And then there's birds that chose not to breed, breeding age adults. They chose not to breed, or perhaps they were failed breeders. Those birds also typically go to Russia for the flightless wing molt. And when I say the flightless wing molts, that would be when emperor geese and all waterfowl do this. They regrow all their flight feathers. Most birds regrow their flight feathers sequentially, so they drop a feather or 2 at a time so that they can retain flight throughout the whole process. Waterfowl do it differently. They shed all their feathers at once. Because of that, they are flightless for about a 25 to 30 day period, and they're regrowing them all at once. Because of that, lots of waterfowl, especially geese, seek out real unique habitats that provide not only good food and nutrients for feather regrowth, but also protection from predators due to their vulnerability during that time. So here's 4 years of location data from the flightless wing molt in Russia. Each color just shows one bird's molting location for that summer for each year. So I've got 4 different color codes per year. So you can see they are using river deltas and lagoons just on the other side of the Bering Strait. And I'm spacing the name of this giant lagoon here. Maybe somebody can help me out after the talk. That's definitely the primary spot where we've seen most of our emperor geese go. But some of them are going quite far up the northern side of the coast. And we've had a lot of our birds go use this part of Russia during the summer. And typically they're there for 2 to 3 months. So for a decent portion of their annual cycle. Thus far, if you recall from those earlier maps, their survival has been remarkably high during this period. We've only had 1 bird die during the flightless wing molt. There was some question about whether there was harvest going on up there during that period. I'm sure there's some, but again, they're very vulnerable. You can actually drive them in large numbers, but it doesn't appear to be prominent given our survival data so far. And here's some locations for our juveniles. Most of them also go up to those same lagoons to molt during the summer. We've also had a few 4 or 5 birds opt not to make that voyage up there and spend the summer on the Yukon Delta where they underwent the molt. So it's not 100% that go up there, but it is the high majority of the birds undertake that flightless wing molt into Russia. So the third topic I wanted to highlight with some of our transmitter data is the winter distribution of emperor geese. Here, again, is just a picture of how our rocket net set up in the winter. This is a picture from Shemya Island. Here, we're targeting this creek outflow here. Geese like to come to shore in small groups to drink fresh water, and that provides us an opportunity to capture birds, typically in smaller groups and family groups. So here's just showing a basic map, 3 winters worth of location data. And this is only location data for birds that we captured on the breeding grounds. So birds captured on the Yukon Delta and on the Seward Peninsula. And, you know, we've only captured at 3 or 4 different spots. So you can see that even though we're going to real discrete spots in the breeding grounds, these birds are spreading out over essentially the entire arc of the winter range, from Kodiak clear across the Aleutians to Attu. You know, we'll catch birds on nests that are only 100 meters apart. One of those birds might up in Attu, one might end up in Kodiak. Attu in particular has really gotten a lot of our birds over the years. Typically we have 10 or more birds wintered on Attu. Shemya has a lot of birds always on Unalaska near Dutch Harbor, False Pass. And then a lot of birds opt to stay on the Alaska Peninsula for the winter and don't undergo that second winter migration. They come down to the Alaska Peninsula in the fall and they stay in those coastal lagoons for the remainder of the winter. And just now that we've kind of gone over a lot of the range of emperor geese across Russia and the Aleutians, I thought I would just tie it all up into one annual cycle. And I borrowed this graphic from the Audubon Society. And they're using transmitter data that was, actually it was from internal implanted transmitters from about 25 years ago now by USGS. But transmitters back then only lasted about a year. But so the yellow dots are where the geese are, and this graphic is starting on January 1st. So moving forward, we're in our winter range on the Aleutians, and now they're going to start migrating up in spring. Here they are in the peninsula, breeding grounds in the Delta. The non-breeders are in Russia, the molters, back into the fall to the Alaska Peninsula, and then winter will come and birds will spread back out the Aleutians. So that's the annual cycle of emperor geese. We're seeing much the same with our transmitter data. And then the last topic I wanted to touch on tonight, given the audience from the Bering Strait here, was the emperor geese of the Seward Peninsula. And this has been a really neat place to visit over the last 5 years. We've been grateful to get out there. This is a picture of us looking for emperor geese nests in typical habitat on the Seward Peninsula. And here we're sitting on sand dunes on barrier islands, and just off to our backside would be the Chukchi Sea. This is the sand dunes that border the Chukchi Sea, and then we're looking down into the coastal flats down here below. And these types of wetland complexes here with these islands and peninsulas, those are the types of place where emperor geese like to breed. So we're hoping to spot geese on nests from up on those sand dunes. So we wanted to capture and implant emperor geese with transmitters on the Seward Peninsula. It seemed easy enough until I started to do a little background research, and there was almost zilch on where to find emperor geese reliably along the Seward Peninsula, aside from going to the northern side. And we need a lot more information for that if we're going to set up a camp and be able to find geese, capture geese, and implant geese with transmitters. And we quickly found out that knowing that they're on the north side of the Seward Peninsula is a long ways. It's about 140 miles from tip to tip. So we needed a lot more intel on where to find geese before we could really set up shop in the area. So in order to do that, we decided that we needed to do some aerial surveys of the area and try to figure out for ourselves exactly where to find emperor geese. Because there was no data for the area, we borrowed a data set of aerial observations of emperor geese from the Fish and Wildlife Service from their Yukon Delta surveys. So they were kind enough to loan us their data set, 35 years of surveys with almost 42,000 observations. And the first thing I did was simply take all of these observations and plot them relative to their distance from the coastline. And as you can see on the y-axis here, I have cumulative percent of all those observations relative to distance to coast. By the time you got out to 15 kilometers, you'd found about 95% of your emperor geese. So I took that and used that as my rule of thumb for designing an aerial survey. And we set up strip transects across the entire northern side of the Seward Peninsula that went from the coast 15 kilometers inland, except for anywhere where those transects started to get into more rugged mountainous areas. Then we truncated the transects once it hit the higher terrain. So these transects are spaced 3 kilometers apart, and we surveyed all of these transects in 2 years, summers in 2018 and 2019 during the breeding season. So when the birds are on the nests, we surveyed 150 transects per year, which equaled just a little bit over 1,000 transect miles flown each year. So it was a pretty extensive survey. It meant a lot of time in the plains, but luckily we were rewarded with some good observations and we were able to find geese. So in the top map, the yellow dots are all our observations of emperor geese, observations that occurred on transect. So these are observations that were used, and I'll get into the analysis here briefly, for more formal population estimation. So all those yellow dots were birds on transect. And then because there was also a lot of transiting around between transects and to and from transects at the beginnings, at the end of the day, we kept track of all of our observations of emperor geese observed off transect. And those are shown with the red dots. And these two locations stood out in particular, Ikpek Lagoon here in the west and Kupik Lagoon on the east side of the peninsula. And those are the two spots that we ended up focusing in on over the next couple of years for our captures and our transmitter implants. But also good concentrations of birds down here at the base of Shishmaref Inlet. This is a Serpentine River system, good numbers there, a few birds up by Cape Espenberg. So we use that data not only to figure out where to trap emperor geese for our transmitter projects, but we also used it to produce a population estimate for the region. To do that, we stratified the area into what we felt were the 3 most prominent habitat types: barrier islands shown in yellow, coastal lowlands in red. So anything, I believe it was under 5 meters in elevation. And then more upland tundra, which was shown in blue. And we use those to generate a population estimate, and our point estimate for the Seward Peninsula as a total estimate was 1,226 birds. And then we also definitely need to pay attention to our 95% confidence intervals, meaning the population most likely falls in that zone from 792 to 1,660 birds. And interestingly, the great majority of birds were found on the barrier islands, but you can tell that's definitely our smallest habitat of them all. The least number of birds were in those upland habitats. But overall, the important point here is that this was a small population, which is probably a lot of the reason why there was so little information available on where to find the birds, because they're hard to find. It was a lot smaller than we expected. But in the scope of Alaska, it's still the second most prominent breeding population that we have outside the Yukon Delta. And it's an important resource for the villages that we have up there on the northern side of the Seward Peninsula. In Shishmaref, whales, they're a culturally important bird. So it's an important population, a small population, but a population worth conserving and keeping our eyes on. But as I was trying to figure out where to find emperor geese were up there and trying to sift through the literature, really the best literature on emperor geese in the Seward Peninsula was stuff published about 100 years ago. And I share a few quotes here from a report published in 1925 by a naturalist named Alfred Bailey. And this guy spent 2 or 3 summers in Wales, just on the western tip there, collecting birds and making museum specimens. And from this report, he said, quote, "Emperor geese breed quite commonly along the shore of Lap Lagoon. And quote, during the daytime, flocks of 50 or more often congregate, flying low along the shores of Lap Lagoon or feeding on the wide stretching bars at the mouths of the various saltwater rivers." And quote, "Also killed my first emperor geese, getting 4. I saw a pair upon the tundra and stalked them. They merely watched me, allowing me within range before they took to flight. A couple 100 yards away was another pair, which I stalked with equal success. Saw several flocks during the day, possibly 100 birds in all." So all of these observations were from Lap Lagoon and near Wales. And just to provide a little perspective for what we saw in the area, here's Lap Lagoon. Wales is just on the western tip here. I don't know why it keeps changing, sorry. We saw 2 birds off transect during 2 years of flying, and we flew over that lagoon a lot. And we saw just 1 bird just east of the lagoon on transect. So are there less birds now? Impossible to know. It's an interesting question to think about. My guess is, yeah, probably. I think there probably are less now. I don't know why. And we had 30 years of harvest closures, and it really doesn't seem to have done much for bumping that population up. So yeah, it's a small population. And like I said, it's something that we want to monitor as we move forward. And then we're going to use our transmitter data to look at the population delineation between these 2 populations to get at that question of, are these populations, the Yukon Delta, where most of the birds are breeding, and the Seward Peninsula, are they interchanging individuals so that we have potential for birds from outside the Seward Peninsula to come in? So here's just all of our data from birds tagged on the Yukon Delta and birds tagged on the Seward Peninsula. Seward Peninsula birds are in red. You can see the Yukon Delta birds don't seem to be using the Seward Peninsula at all. But once they're molting in Russia, there seems to be a lot of overlap between the populations. The Seward Peninsula birds are transiting heavily through the Yukon Delta, lots of overlap there. And then across their entire winter range from Attu over to Kodiak, there's a lot of interlap. So it seems like outside of that breeding window, there's heavy overlap between the populations. So last slide here, just to talk about future directions and where we'll be going. We're still putting out transmitters. As I mentioned, we're going to Kodiak next week. to put out some more transmitters. These transmitters, they've been lasting about 4 years, and we have plans to keep doing this for some years into the future. So we anticipate having a ongoing database that'll allow us to monitor survival and get at some of these important questions. And it's having a monitoring database like that serves a lot of purposes, some unforeseen. And one recent example that's been interesting, and one you would never be able to anticipate, was the outbreak of highly pathogenic avian influenza. I'm sure a lot of you have heard about that. Our database will be able to give us some insight into potential effects of the high path AI outbreak on emperor geese. We had over 100 bird tagged before that began. It's still ongoing. So that's some of the ways in which monitoring data is useful. I'm sure there'll be other unanticipated events down the road. And then I was talking about the differentiation between the Yukon Delta and Seward Peninsula birds. We're also hoping to get at that from a genetic angle in the coming years with colleagues from USGS. We've got that neat transmitter data to show the potential for the populations to overlap, and we'd like to learn a little bit more about if that's being realized from a genetic sense. So that's all I got tonight. Thank you, everybody.
All right. Well, thank you, Tyler Lewis, because that was very interesting. I didn't even know about our little secret stash up in the Seward Peninsula North Shore. I didn't know those were so distinct. This is the time when I say to the audience, you might want to, we have questions. I see hands are raised, so we'll get to it, but this is the time to give the speaker a little love in the chat box. It is never easy to be a speaker. I've got to be one tomorrow. So I feel your pain there, Tyler, and you're done. And you did a great job. So well done. And Charlie, I see you're patiently with your hand up. So let's get to you first. Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, that was a super talk. And I once, long time ago, in 1979, shot several, well, more like 6, I guess, emperor geese in Jute Bay near Bisharoff Lake. But on the Seward Peninsula, have you flown around Immerok Lake? It's a lake, was on the very edge of your map. There are so many molting geese on that lake. It's incredible. It's stampede across that lake. And there's also a nesting area due east of Immerok Lake and due south of Deering. And it's called the Burnt River Flats. And I've been sampling out there for fisheries stuff years ago. And it's a swampy peat bog with just studded with nests of the previous year. I assume they're goose nests. But anyway, looks like to me that the birds nest and then they molt on Immerok Lake. And you should really look at that.
I'm just sharing my screen here. You see my map again? Do people see that?
Nope, we see your blue screen.
Let me try one more time. That might work.
Okay.
Yeah, I've heard, I don't think I'm familiar with Immerok Lake. I'm familiar with the term Immerok from the basin, but is it within this transect zone here?
Okay, you see in the southeastern corner, there's a green lake. Southeast corner, way down. Down.
Oh, I know what you're talking about. Yeah, down by the lava fields down there in the park. We have not been down there, no.
That's a big lake, and there's a lot of geese on it.
Yeah, that'd be neat to see.
And there's a nesting place just to the east of that. And it's I was out there for 4 days one time. And the lake has grayling and snails, lots of snails. And it's an archaeological site that's incredible. They're native people 100+ years ago lived there and drove caribou. There's net sinkers all over the shore. And it's looks like you could make your living just catching stampeding geese. There was a pack of wolves that just laid there on the shore, so full they couldn't walk from eating geese.
Sounds like a place we need to visit.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We haven't been into that region of the peninsula yet. So
Yep, that's
that
like
would be interesting.
800-foot elevation, and it's I went there not looking for birds at all, but what a place. Anyway, yeah.
Interesting, honestly.
So that's something that was my comment.
Thank you, Charlie.
Yeah, thanks, Charlie. So the first question in the chat box was from Wade Shock, and they asked, do you have issues with nest abandonment with the trapping method? And I think that would be the one where you're catching the bird on the right on the nest.
Right. Yes, we monitored that. We cause about 50% of them to abandon in that first year that we catch them. In subsequent years, they seem to get right back to the show.
And I had put down, I think it is Coluchin Bay. I think I spelled it wrong, but Coluchin Bay is that bay in Chukotka, just north of Cape Dezhnev and Nakhon, and you keep going up the coast into that. But I could be wrong there.
This one right here.
Oh.
That what you're...
Yes, that one right there.
Yeah.
I think there's a Y in there somewhere.
Okay. Yeah, that one, yeah, is a great place for emperors, it seems to be. It'd be amazing to see it in an aerial survey. I'd be fascinated to see how big the flocks are.
It's a great place for all kinds of wildlife, I've been told. And let's see, Gnome asks, how much longer do you plan to put transmitters in the geese on the Seward Peninsula?
We're done. I'm pretty sure we're done. We did it last summer, and that was our last summer going up there. Yeah.
Okay, so you're just going to focus on the...
Yeah, we put out, I forget how many up there, 30 transmitters or so. Given the population size up there, I want to tread lightly. And so I don't want to overextend a biologist impact up there. So unless we feel there's a pressing need from a conservation or research angle to get back up there, I don't anticipate doing any more transmitter work up there.
All right. Any other questions for Tyler? I have a couple. If no one else does. One would be, so what, you don't have any idea of the cause of the decline from the 60s to the 80s?
I don't, and I've never really heard
And why
it.
they're suppressed now, like even with no real hunting effort, they just don't want to seem to boom back up?
Yeah, well, so I don't know why they had that sharp decline in the 1980s. It would be fascinating to know. I've never really heard a compelling reason why, and I don't think nothing's known, and I don't think it will ever be known. In terms of population potential of emperor geese, I think what you see is what you get with them, and it's important to realize that they're wildly different than most other North American geese. If you look at population trajectories of most North American geese over the last 30 decades, the growth has been spectacular. And that's because those birds are taking advantage of agricultural resources during the winter. So their populations, which historically would have been constrained by winter food availability, that constraint has largely been lifted. And with that move of birds like snow geese, the most famous example, to these agricultural subsidies, you've got these huge booms in population growth. With emperor geese, because they are 100% of the year using natural habitats, for better or worse term to describe it, they're not getting any subsidies from man-made habitats. And so I think winter is probably the biggest constraint on their population. So I think the population growth potential is lower, and they will be more prone to winter-related mortality events and things like that.
Do they have any sort of special dietary needs? Because they seem to be on the ocean or on the coast. Are they just like are they more marine than the other geese?
I don't know if they have special dietary needs, but during the winter, they have a marine diet, almost strictly marine.
And what would that be?
So seaweeds, algae, and invertebrates. And interestingly, in Shemya, it seems like, I mean, we're only there for 2 weeks a year, so I can't speak to the whole winter, but the birds we've handled and the birds we've observed, it seems like they are on almost a strictly vegetarian diet on seaweeds and algae, which is not what I expected. But the birds in Kodiak are foraging heavily on barnacles, on mussels. Their feces, when you catch them, is littered with shells. So there does seem to be some site discrepancy, but they feed a lot on mollusks and invertebrates too in the winter.
Could they be susceptible to harmful algal bloom? Not that they'd be in the winter, I guess, but it would, that's interesting. Their diet is so sea ducky.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, you can watch them pull barnacles off rocks. It's they're quite powerful, surprisingly.
Dedicated.
Yeah, that's an interesting question about the algal blooms. I don't know enough about the timing of that. Yeah,
Yeah, I
during
think that was strange timing, but it does seem
Okay.
but anything kind of goes nowadays. My other question was, if you were in the region, we were beset a bit with avian influenza, and we had very few samples that could go out, but we got positives on the glaucous gulls. Actually, I do have one more thing, if anyone else wants to jump in, but we got positives for glaucous gulls and for red fox in the Bering Strait region. Did you see any of that? Were you also collecting birds for avian influenza testing when you were up here? I don't know when your tagging effort was. I don't remember when you said.
We were up there last summer, and we saw very little evidence up there last summer. I don't think we had any direct observations we were in Ikpek Lagoon of sick or ill birds. And right before we were in Ikpek in mid-June for about 10 days, but we had come there straight from the Yukon Delta, where we saw evidence of sick birds frequently, especially glaucous gulls, like you mentioned. We saw a lot of sick brant. We saw a few dead emperor geese. So yeah, I have no doubt it was up there. We were fortunate that we seemed to be observing largely healthy birds while we were up there.
And I can't remember, I lost my train of thought. There's a lot going on up here. On my last question, I'm going to be sorry, I can't remember it. Does anyone else have a question? They've got a lot of nice kudos in the chat box. I can't think of that. So and Michael C, who's calling in checking in all the way from Hilo, Hawaii. Is there any thoughts or things, anything comment from yourself? You're our far-reaching viewer.
No, actually, I can't think of anything. Well, I'm thinking a lot about, first of all, thank you for the presentation. And it was a lot more than I knew before. I just know it's our clan bird. And I was just curious, is it possible that there's breeding grounds in further south in the in the Siberian Asian Peninsula?
Yeah, they definitely breed in Asia in the Bering Strait region. The number of birds that breed there, that would be something we would love to know. We don't know too much about it, but in the Gulf of Anadyr, along the coastline there and in some of the river deltas, there's definitely a breeding population of birds. And those birds are definitely making their way into Alaska for a good chunk of their annual cycle. And interestingly, we have marked a few adult females in the winter, including one on Shemya last year that ended up being a Russian breeding bird. So we do have, I guess, one transmitter on a Russian breeding bird. So it will be interesting to track her in the coming years.
That is interesting because you know, half of my people, 3/4 of my people are in Siberia, and 1/4 are on St. Lawrence Island. So there's, you know, my grandparents used to go back and forth before the Cold War. So it just sort of makes sense that perhaps there is, you know, and probably because of politics, you cannot research in Siberia.
Oh, I wish, yeah, politics would be, especially now, yeah. But yeah, I guess, yeah, I hadn't thought of the analogy, but in many ways, the emperor geese and their use of the Bering Strait region is analogous to your people and their free flow across the region. The emperor geese would be using many of the same regions and treating Russia just as a larger part of Beringia.
Mm-hmm. This is, yeah, I can't wait to hear more about research and what's going on. I'm curious about the antenna when once they've once, is there any does it fall out or?
Nope, it's there, the antenna. The way it projects out, the birds, they'll preen it and mess with it usually in the first couple of days, and then they leave it alone. And you know, I don't know a decade down the road if it's still there. That's a good question. But during the duration of the battery life of the transmitter, yeah, it's still there.
That's interesting that the body heat of the bird would save the battery instead of freezing, killing the battery life.
It's a great microclimate for the battery, is what the engineers at the transmitter company have said. It's a really ideal temperature, apparently.
The picture of the icing was kind of just horrific. I mean, imagine the weight of that. I never even thought of icing on tags. So it makes me think about some other animals and their tags they have.
Yeah, it would have been fascinating to see those emperor geese in the 80s with their collars to see if that was happening. Yeah.
Right. All right. Well, thank you, Tyler Lewis. And we're so glad that Gamble brought that one of your birds out of the sky, and this fell. And so we all learned together thanks to that goose and yourself. So thank you for bringing that to the Bering Strait region. Any last questions? If not, next week is going to be on Thursday, February 9th. We have Larry Hinsman, and I've got to read this out, but Larry Hinsman is the Assistant Director for Polar Science at the Office of Science and Technology in the Executive Office of the President of the United States. What is he going to be talking to us about? He's going to be talking about the U.S. National Strategy for the Arctic, of which, can I just say that Nome is the only place actually mentioned by name in the strategy for the Arctic. And he's also going to talk about the Arctic Research Plan that takes Arctic research plans through 2026. So he's going to be, we've asked him, what do these plans mean for the Bering, what do they mean? And then what do they mean for the Bering Strait region? So how do they relate? So this will be really interesting and a different kind of thing for me, but I am really curious to hear what he has to say for these two national directives for the Arctic, and they mentioned Nome, and here we are. So that is what's going to be on. And I don't know, Tyler, should I add you to the mailing list?
That'd be great. Yeah.
All
please.
right. And Michael C., I don't know how to get a hold of you, but if you Google UAF Strait Science, you'll find a link to my name somewhere in there in the beginning. If you would like to watch any more of these as well, we were talking earlier, so thank you for that. And with that, why doesn't Tyler, if you don't mind staying on the line, we'll call it a wrap for tonight, and we'll hopefully see you all next week. Thank you so much for coming from the top of the state down to everybody down south. Good night.